We're here at Cyberscoop's Zero Trust Summit with Leo Taddeo, CISO and President, Federal Division at Appgate. Leo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wyatt. Thank you.
Let me start by asking, how has OMB Zero Trust requirements for agencies to adopt things like enterprise-wide platforms for identity and access management and multi-factor authentication, how's that impacted government contractors and IT providers like your firm?
Well, that's a great question. I think we're all still trying to figure that out. The administration has rightly emphasized the value of zero trust, but interpreting the OMB's guidance into real programs and real services that can deliver on the zero trust value is still a work in process. Many vendors are collaborating both internally and with partners to come up with what they believe will be the proper zero trust technology stack. We're certainly one of those, but the government hasn't decided exactly what it means by zero trust. It's certainly adopting those principles, both backwards looking in terms of legacy architectures, and also implementing those principles in future projects. So I think we are still in the process of figuring out what zero trust really means for the government in terms of how it interprets itself into a technology deliverable.
Great point. Next, what challenges do you see government agencies still facing trying to maintain, for example, a complete inventory of authorized devices as prescribed by OMB and ensure that their endpoint protection tools are deployed properly?
Right, so the first is, it's very hard for agencies to determine what devices are managed and not managed, because we are in an environment where, of course, it's BYOD, but BYOD plus, because we had the effects of the pandemic forcing us to work from home in a very short time frame. So the first part of that question is about understanding what's authorized and what's not authorized, understanding what's managed and what's not managed. Practically speaking, anything with a username and password these days is technically authorized on most systems. There may be multi-factor authentication required, but very few agencies are limiting access to only devices that are government issued. Same on the commercial side. The commercial enterprises that we work with have to allow devices that are not owned by the enterprise to access the data and the services that employees need to do their job. In terms of the EDR solutions, the vendors of EDR solutions have already configured the solution to report whether it's properly deployed. So that's really not the challenge. The challenge in the zero trust architecture is, how do we use that data to make access decisions? How can we take that proper deployment and use it in a risk analysis to say this machine, because it has this EDR, is allowed to access these services? That's a larger and more complex challenge than just figuring out whether an EDR solution is properly deployed.
Also a great point, thank you. And then thirdly, how well equipped would you say federal agencies are today compared to, say, a couple of years ago to identify and isolate segments of their IT enterprise environments if when they've been compromised?
Yeah, so that goes to the heart of the zero trust value proposition, and that is we no longer have segments. There's no longer an inside and an outside. Every asset is its own segment. There's the segment of one. And so from an incident response or from a threat mitigation point of view, it's no longer viable to articulate the ability to isolate a segment, because we have a hybrid environment, and what we're trying to protect could exist in a cloud, it could also exist on-prem. And so the concept of segment is eliminated, basically, with the proper implementation of zero trust architecture. What we should be thinking about is, what characteristics are we going to isolate? Should we isolate all machines that have now demonstrated they are running an operating system that has a newly discovered vulnerability, for example? That's the way we ought to think about segmentation. It's not so much segmenting a particular VLAN or a particular geographic location. It's how can we determine from the characteristics we can collect from an asset whether we should trust that asset, not where it is. So the idea of isolating a segment makes less sense in a zero trust architecture and has less value as a threat mitigation technique.
It makes a lot of sense. And then lastly, looking ahead, how are OMB Zero Trust policies altering the investment strategy that you have in place at your company?
Well, we're a zero trust company, so we are all in on zero trust. So our investment strategy is perfectly aligned with the zero trust architecture and the zero trust value proposition. Other vendors are also realigning their investments. We see systems integrators creating zero trust solutions. We see advisory services, advisory firms creating zero trust practices. And so the world of zero trust is developing based on these investments. But it sort of goes back to the first question, and that is everyone's really just trying to figure out exactly where the government's taking zero trust. It's a set of principles, it's an architectural design. It's not necessarily a product yet. And that's probably a good thing. It's good for us to experiment. It's good for us to decide what has most value. It's good for us to decide the taxonomy we're going to use to describe how zero trust works. And I think we've made great progress in the zero trust maturity thinking. What is it that we mean when we say this is more like zero trust than it was before, and having as a maturity model around that. In terms of actual investments, more time and money is being spent on describing products as zero trust solutions. So I think there's a little bit of marketing pixie dust being sprinkled on old ideas, and we have to be careful of that. But for the most part, we have young people and very talented engineers who are thinking about the core zero trust principles, how to develop technologies to implement them, how to make them consumable, and how to make them future-proof. So we are, among many, making those exact investments.
Well, Leo, Taddeo, thank you so much for joining us here at the Zero Trust Summit.
Thank you.